both been very stimulating presentations. I've got a lot of points that I'm tempted to raise myself, but I won't, because ODI's main discussant is going to be Dirk Willem to Velde, who will start now, I think.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you, Ganesh Matsuma, for these interesting presentations. I'll have comments. Hopefully it will. And I'll center them on sort of three areas. First of all, I'd sort of like to comment on the rise of Asia and how important it is. And just to comment on the fact that it is basically at this particular moment when the global financial crisis has hit the global economy, and that we see Asia emerging very rapidly from it, and Europe not so fast emerging from it at all. And particularly we'll see probably a period of slow growth in the coming few years. And at the same time that the focus is much more now on global problems, Asia rising, Europe not so much emerging out of the crisis, that will have implications for development policy, and development policy by the UK and by the EU. And I sort of divide them into sort of two parts. The first is to think more about the implications of how sort of the EU is working with Asia, and the other one is basically what is could the EU sort of help Africa sort of stand up to the challenge of and the positive effects from Asia. Right. So let's first, of course, comment on the rise of Asia. We've got a chart here that shows real GDP growth, and in sort of three regions. We've got Sub-Saharan Africa, we've got the advanced economies, and developing Asia. And developing Asia is sort of leading now the recovery in the global economy. It is starting to import quite a lot from low-income countries, including Sub-Saharan Africa, and in that sense, Asia has been sort of a cushion against the worst effects of the global financial crisis for low-income countries. And that's something you can find also in the synthesis of the studies that we've coordinated at ODI on the effects of the global financial crisis in low-income countries. You can download this publication from the web. There are likely to be many spillovers from Asian growth into other regions, and it's also looking as if spillover effects have changed over time, and I think that needs much more detailed research, of course. But I've just looked at some simple correlations between sort of developing Asia growth and low-income country growth, and you can do it very generally, and that's what I've done here, a correlation matrix. And particularly sort of before 2000, there wasn't a strong correlation between Asian growth and low-income country growth, but after 2000, there was a stronger correlation between low-income country growth and Sub-Saharan African growth with Asian growth. You can think about pathways through which it has worked. Right. The EU-Asia process, and Ganesh already mentioned that. Ganesh mentioned that there's increasing trade within Asia, but there's also increasingly trade within amongst EU-Asia. So, for instance, the ASEM Asia share of total EU exports has increased over time recently, and the same has happened to the share of EU in ASEM Asia exports. So these regions are increasingly integrated. Not enough, as you would have hoped, perhaps, but there is at least a trend going on. And the same is happening in FDI. And Ganesh already put up some numbers. These here are some aggregate numbers of share of ASEM Asia in EU foreign direct investment, and the other way around, the share of EU in ASEM Asia foreign direct investment. And I prepared these sort of numbers also for an ASEM preparatory meeting a couple of weeks or a month ago in Indonesia, to show that there's so much more going on between in terms of economic relations between EU, Asia than just aid. Foreign investment integration has also increased dramatically. Maybe not as enough as you've hoped, but there is a trend going on. But then there's more, and particularly in terms of how EU is interested in Asia, should be interested even more in Asia, is that there are lots of reserves being accumulated. And of course, this is a deliberate policy after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, is to accumulate more reserves. But the top 6 countries, in terms of international reserves in absolute value, 4 of them are Asian. And there's a lot of reserves going on. And I think that what Gan has also mentioned on its slide was that Asia can help with the rebalancing of the world economy. Now, how do you use these reserves? A lot of these reserves, I mean, we have heard all the stories that Chinese reserves are invested in US treasuries. So there's about $1 trillion of its reserves is invested in US treasuries with quite a low return. But it's liquid, so you can at least sort of withdraw the funds if you wanted to. There are much more complex linkages going on and so on than just that. But another way to spend the funds is through sovereign wealth funds. So about 10% of, say, Chinese wealth, its international reserves, is spent through sovereign wealth funds, and that you can also think about putting the spotlight on that. How those funds are being spent. These funds are being spent, of course, in financial companies, financial services companies in the West. We recently heard maybe some stake in BP even recently. There are lots of discussions ongoing, but so far there hasn't been much investment in Africa. And I think that's something that could be examined in much more detail. We know that there are quite a lot of profitable opportunities going on in Africa. The rates of return of multinational investment in Africa have always consistently been much higher than the profits in other regions. So we just know that there are lots of profits to be had. So there's likely to be sort of an interest in thinking about how the reserves are going to be used in order to sort of rebalance the economy, both into sort of the EU but also in poorer countries. And that's the next slide is sort of thinking about making the link with the presentation with Matuma, which is about what you could call the scramble for African resources. That China increasingly invests in natural resources in poorer countries, but it's not just China. It is, of course, it's Brazil, it's Russia as well, which is a major investor in Africa. It's India, and it's other emerging markets. And these emerging markets are increasingly stepping up their investment in Africa, but Asia the lead. And whilst at the same time there was much more cautious engagement from Europe in Africa, and that has implications. So there's a scramble for resources, i.e. that puts a much stronger bargaining position in the hands of African countries, in theory. And the question, of course, is how can you use it? And that leads me to the conclusions. We've commented on the rise of Asia, and I think it's very important that we just do much more on this. We need to understand it much more, and what the implications are, yes, for the EU, but also for development policy, the EU vis-à-vis Asia, but also the EU's policies, development policy in low-income countries, including in Africa. Is this now a critical juncture that we're talking about? Is the increasing rise in Asian economies coupled with the increased fiscal consolidation in the developed countries and the increasing interest in global problems, climate change, security, and so on. Is that a critical juncture for development policy, including how EU is looking at supporting African growth and development? In terms of the EU's development policy vis-à-vis Asia, it's now likely, or it's very important now to say that it has to go beyond aid. My brief at the ASEM Development Conference a month ago was to talk about policy coherence, which is sort of talking about anything else than aid. But it's just so clear that there's, from development policy side, you need to look much more on trade, FDI linkages, and so on, and it's much more than aid. And secondly, about Africa. Africa will benefit a lot from the rise of Asia, but it depends on, and I here agree very much with what Tsuma said, on sort of an active engagement. I'm not sure whether there should be a China policy as such. I don't know whether every country has had an EU policy or an US policy. I'm not sure. But I do think that it's important to highlight what are the issues of substance behind it. What does the rise of China mean for which substantive issues African countries need to look at? Some African countries that have are rich in resources will need to look much more in terms of their natural resources policy, and there's going to be a lot of attention towards access to natural resources in the global environment, and I think that's where that's one key. And it's not just China. I think it's also Brazil. It's increasingly also other countries. Secondly, what you mentioned as well is the need to upgrade. Whether it is linkages, yes, I mean one could be linkages, but I think I would say more like upgrading. You can use the resources to upgrade into whether it's manufacturing or services in other economies. And again, these the increasing investment by other countries in Africa should lead to a lot of resources, and those resources need to be used well. It's important to ensure that African countries that are exporting increasingly natural resources to emerging markets are not stuck in a low-income, low-skill trap, and whereby they export raw commodities and they import manufacturers from China, from India, and so on. So they need to get out of that, and for that it's very important to think about an active upgrading policy, to think about a technology policy, skills policy, and investment policy, even more so than they've done in the past. And I think we can be positive about the way active policies can work now. Maybe in the past we were very pessimistic about the rise of or the effectiveness of active policies, maybe industrial policies, active growth policies in poorer countries. But I think there are ways through which that can work, and particularly the global financial crisis has shown that poorer countries are not engaged in a knee-jerk reaction, increasingly becoming protectionist or whatever. They have just followed their policies, and in some cases their active policies have worked. So I'm optimistic here, and I also note that increasingly the World Bank, Justin Lin, is thinking about structural economics, where industrial policy increasingly plays a role. So what is the future for this? And finally, there's now a lot of wealth around, and it's not just it is not in the traditional trading partners of poorer countries in Africa. It is in Asia, and that's where there needs to be a lot more engagement. And how can you leverage in the sovereign wealth funds? How do we talk to sovereign wealth funds? How can we leverage them in? How can we can this wealth be sort of put to productive use in poorer countries? But I would like to thank finally Danesh and Tsuma for this stimulating discussion. I hope we have much more of these important discussions moving forward in the coming 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you.